So if you're ready, then I suggest we start.
Okay, Pavlin, you will do the welcome.
Yes, I would like to welcome you all to this second webinar on DCAT-AP for high-value dataset. It is the objective of this webinar is creating a common metadata descriptions for high-value dataset. Based on the existing solution of DCAT-AP, which will be in a collaborative way in the sense that it's a joint effort along with our colleagues from DG Connect and also taking into consideration the work that's been done from DG Environment. Here is the agenda of our today's webinar. We will also liaise it to the work that has been presented and discussed during the previous webinar. Next slide, please. We kindly ask you to mute your microphones. Please feel free to share your questions and via the chat, or alternatively raise your hands. Upon your consent, we would like to ask for your permission to record this webinar in order to share the recordings afterwards. And feel free, but not obligatory, to introduce yourself in the chat, providing your name, affiliation, and contact email information. It's we fully respect the GDPR regulation, but somehow it is important for us to know who is attending the meeting, because the audience is a mixed audience containing members of DCAT-AP working group, along with members of the PSI working group. Having said that, I pass the floor to my colleague Bert with the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavlina. I will first do a short introduction to the context of this webinar and what we have done in the past, the previous webinar, and then start with the webinar. Max Dekkers will support me in the timekeeping and to taking an eye on the chat and the interaction. Okay, so what we did in the last webinar, in the previous webinar, so we had a look out to what is how the governance of this activity was. We established this activity, how it will work and what we will do. We presented an assessment of the high-value datasets implementing regulation from the perspective of metadata, so that you have an idea about that, what is in there. We introduced DCAT-AP, and we started discussing on some topics. And of course, this was very lively, and based on that, we had some learnings. One of the learnings was that there were some differences in expectations on the implementation, how you do that, the high-value datasets implementing regulation, how you take that as for an implementer. So we will work on that in the first phase. And that there was as well need for the community as a whole to reflect on the different topics. So that's why we will represent the same topics today as from the first webinar, with the feedback that we got already online and during the webinar of the first webinar. So this is taking that into account. So as you know, so the outcome of this work is that we are creating a guideline, a document that expresses how DCAT-AP can be used in order to satisfy those metadata requirements that are expressed in the implementing regulation. And we shared in the reminder of this webinar, the invitation of this webinar, a link to a preliminary draft. Here you see the link again. And at the end, in the wrap-up, we will have a short tour around it so that you can have a shared collaborative reading of it. So as Pavlina already mentioned, so this activity is a supported activity not only from SDMX DCAT, but as well in collaboration with Connect, and as well where we have a strong collaboration with DG Environment and GRC in the context of the geospatial community. So that is, let's say, the shared perspective from the EC level that we take into account here. So if we go back, and this is then the first lesson learned, in the sense of we realized that implementing and the high value datasets in regulation, that answers some questions, how to approach it, what to do, etc. And therefore we want to do this, present a new or a more in-depth flow on how you can do it. So the first thing is that we want to stress out that the high value data set is an engagement. So it calls for an engagement from each member state to do extra or continue the efforts with regards to the identified data sets in the annex. So there are identified data sets, and for those you do as a member state take up the engagement to make them workable, accessible, in conformance with the legislation. And how this is in the end working is that at the point that the regulation is in force, member states have to provide a list of those identified data sets for which they take up this engagement. So this is part of the reporting, and this is so it connects the two words. As such, if you look to this list, so that each member state have to organize itself. So there's no guidance or nothing stated that there should be some governance set up, something like that. Every member state takes this organization on itself in order to provide the list and to provide the right level of support and engagement. And the goal, of course, is that what is on the list is not retractable. And so this is the idea of these persistent links that you find in the implementing regulation. So when it's persistent, you keep on going and you keep on maintaining it. So this is the goal, that retraction is not the main objective, but the goal is the engagement and the continuation on that. And for that, it's not only on one specific data category domain, but it's actually across many domains, and that's caused as an effect. And we hear that to collaborate across different portals and domains. So open data with geospatial, with statistical domain, and all these things have to collaborate together. So what we do here at the level of DCAT-AP is in general domain agnostic, but of course we have been from the past mostly engaged with open data portals, and so this is as well an activity then where we reach out to collaborate more in the domains and to align on them. Having said that, if you look to the annex and the individual annex, then you will find that there are, for each thematic data category, so there are 6 of them, there is a reference to the legislative or thematic description about the datasets that have to be provided. And on top of that, there are some high-value datasets implementing regulation requirements, and they have an interplay. How this interplay is exactly working, that is up to the discussion, and that's what we do here at the level of DCAT-AP on a broad level. But of course, the same or the discussion has to be taken as well to the different domains and to the individual legislative aspects. And one of these examples is the geospatial domain, where they already as well started to create a track on how to tackle the challenges that are expressed and the needs that are expressed in the specific scope that in the Inspire scope, what is happening over there and is needed. And they have built up or building up a roadmap to provide the right guidelines for each member state for those data sets that fall under the Inspire regulation. And what we do, so we have, that's the blue, DCAT-AP is then the high level, the broader perspective across all of them. And then we have to combine on that. And one of the elements that, of course, out of this, let's say, elaboration comes is how we can bind the two together. And we have a profile, GeoDCAT-AP. Then it comes out that, of course, that how can Inspire high-value datasets and GeoDCAT high-value datasets be realized. So how we can support each other. So this is a goal that reaches that needs a lot of collaboration and coordination. And so in this case, for this data category team for geospatial, we already have established an EC level coordination across environments, GeoC, Connect, and DCAT. This is not only the one thing that's about the individual data sets so far, so you have to take up as a member state engagement. There's also this aspect of reporting, and on the regulation itself, it states that these data sets have to be reported according to the metadata, according to the domain requirements, and in the end as well provide a global report, and that format has not been established yet, but we have to at least get information together as a member state so that you can provide a report. And that is where DCAT-AP comes into the play, as it is domain agnostic. It can support you as a member state to provide this base information that is needed for the reporting. But that doesn't excuse yourself, of course, to perform and to publish the datasets according to the metadata requirements of each domain. So that is in addition to you have to do. So as I said, so our goal is that DCAT-AP can support in that. It is domain agnostic, so we can cover on all these areas. And so today, what we want to do with you is create a set of guidelines for DCAT-AP so that we capture the key metadata notions that are expressed in the regulation very well and as good as possible, and create this kind of helicopter overview. Of course, this is not just into the void. The goal is that by doing this at this level of DCAT-AP, we link as well with real metadata. So it's not just pure reporting aspect. So we don't create metadata for the reporting. The goal is that we can use immediately real metadata from your data portals so that you can use the DCAT-AP high-value datasets metadata descriptions as basis for the reporting in the end. And maybe here this is a platform, and so this might be needed to have some platform from the level of the EC level on all the data categories. DCAT-AP can facilitate that to create some kind of a harmonization discussion on what is on the shared requirements. So that could be a place that you can, if you have concerns or interpretation challenges, that you say, okay, how you tackle this in this domain, how see other domains that DCAT-AP for high-value datasets could facilitate in this common interpretation, so that in the end the reporting becomes more consistent as well. So if we look today, then we can make a bold statement, and that if you already have published all your metadata of all the data sets according to all the legislations that are mentioned in the annex of the regulation, you probably have captured all data sets already in dataeuropa.eu in that portal. So if that is being harvested, probably you have many of them already. And they are just two perspectives that we can then be raising as well from this implementing regulation is how we make those visible on the portal, how we can see that, how we create a shared story in the portal perspective from these high value data sets. And on the other side, on the publisher side, how we can transform or add something to the metadata so that it becomes high value datasets compliant without impacting too much the current practices, but with a maximal realization, so towards the reporting and towards the compliancy.
I have a question in the chat from Mihai. I think a question to DG Connect, whether or not there is an intention to have more regulated approaches to at least some of the categories for some of the priority domains. Is there a plan to have, or do you know if there is an initiative to regulate some of those domains?
Actually, there are 6 domains, including geospatial data and some others, that are specifically mentioned in the EU Commission regulation. That's why I'm asking, because they are specifically named there. Probably there are also some more specific expectancies. I don't know. What impact will that have on DCAT? That will be a question.
From the Commission side, there's ongoing discussions about the new version of the Inspired Directive, but this is what is going to. Well, there is the review of the Inspired Directive being planned for the end of this year and the next year, and for the rest, it's on the sectorial level. So, I don't have this information. In which kind of priority domains should be more regulated on this level. So,
and I see from Lucinio that in the e-health environment, in the health data space, there are special provisions. Oh, okay, I think that was it. Bert, you want to continue?
Okay, good. So, having said this, that is our challenge. Saying, okay, how can augment and to make those these data sets, high value data sets, or in scope visible in our current metadata. And I created a visual graph to show what is the kind of the objective for what you want to create. So today, with DCAT-AP and harvesting and all this happens, you can create essentially a knowledge graph. And it looks something like this. So we have catalogs that are being interconnected with each other, sharing data services and data sets sharing distributions. And you get this kind of complex graph of information that is being shared from, if you look in an abstract way, through Data Europa to the EU, to the knowledge that we share. And the goal is that we actually start to color those that are in scope, and for those that are in scope, that those guidelines that we are discussing today will apply. So the goal is that the guidelines that we discussed today are applied to those yellow ones and can be applied. And to identify that those are for maybe of some collection or reporting purposes, we could actually even add an extra catalog to say, okay, this is the catalog of interest that I want to follow or to present as a member state to report. So in general, and that's why the coloring and then showing the graph is that this graph means that we cannot necessarily scope very easily what is inside of outside provided by some party, and therefore we might have to do some additional efforts in the end for some annotations or for reporting purposes. But we will go deeper on that in the individual topics. So before I jump to start on the individual topics, are there any questions relating this global introduction?
I have no questions left in the chat. Anybody who wants to raise their hand or put something in the chat? If not, I suggest we just continue, Brett.
Okay, good. So our plan is to have 3 topics at first, and then have a short break, depending of the time permits, and then we tackle the remaining topics before we do the wrap up. Okay, topic 1. The goal is that, first of all, that we can do the coloring, so to identify that something is in scope, and we see that this being in scope of a legislation, in this case, the high-value dataset regulation. It's not a single request that just comes out of this regulation, this track, but actually pops up more recently in a broader request. So it's not only about the high-value datasets, but as well from the Digital Single Gateway, Data Governance Act, sorry, my apologies, and maybe other legislations that are coming. And the proposal is that has been raised on GitHub, and it's on issue 260, is that we create a new property here identified with the URI R5R application legislation, applicable legislation, where R5R stands for the data Europa namespace that we use to introduce new properties for DCAT-AP, which was maybe unclear in the last webinar. And the goal of this property is that we link it with, fill it with values of legal resources, ELI legal resources, the URI, the persistent URI of the legislation. So if you're not yet aware of it, Europe has a schema, agreed schema to denote uniquely every legislation in Europe, ELI, European Legislation Identifier. And so you can use that to point to legislation. And the goal is to have and to apply this to all main classes in DCAT-AP: dataset, data service, distribution, catalog, and including in DCAT-3 dataset series. And it would look like, as at the bottom, for 2 examples, for the Data Governance Act, we can point to the first ELI, and for the high-value dataset, it would be always this value to this implementing regulation. So that is the goal of this one. Doing so, and okay, the next. There are, well, maybe before let's ask if there are any comments on this one. And then I'll go to F2 implementing aspects on it, and it might be raising different questions.
I had just one comment from Ine de Visser, but that's more in general, that the starting point should be the Inspire formats and the ISO formats for those areas. I would think that are mentioned in the regulation as needing to be in conformance with Inspire.
Yes, so you have to maintain. So anyhow, you have to ensure that the metadata is presented as Inspire. But if you want to do the reporting, then you have to, as a member state, do a reporting across all domains. And here we assume that somehow the Inspire metadata is transformed into DCAT metadata, and then you use that one as the basis for the reporting. You can do, of course, as a member state, something different as well, but that's the idea at the moment.
And a question from Licinio of whether there can also be a European health data space dataset in this.
There are 2 aspects onto it on the European health data space dataset. It's one is here we focus only on it's applicable in a legislation. So with this one, you identify only the legislation that is applicable, whereas in the health data space data sets, there might be more rules or more aspects that you want to add to it. So it is might be a real profile and having some additional aspects. But this is a property we would like to introduce, an individual property, just to identify the legislation. But it can be repeatable. Yes.
I understand what you. So I'm not confusing with a possible DCAT-AP health extension. So that's one thing. It's the Article 58 of the regulation that we call minimum dataset specifications, where the Commission can, by means of implementing acts, determine the minimum specifications for cross-border datasets for specific use. So it's called cross-border datasets, but the concept is very much like high-value datasets. And that's why I was asking if for that Article 58, possibly, or it would be an hypothesis to use EHDS dataset, mentioning that the base of this dataset comes from the EHDS regulation. Thank you for considering.
Yeah, that's Lucini, that would be indeed. Let's have a look to it, but in principle, I think it could be considered.
There is a question from Ludger saying that you mentioned here the main classes. So the question is, his question is there a plan to add it to catalogs and data services?
And the goal is on, as like on the slide, it is for all of them, or at least on the main. I don't see yet needed for any of the supporting classes. So that is the one.
And
so
then
to
there is
cover all of them.
a comment from Kuldar asking whether this property is repeatable.
Yes.
For example, if it's DGA and the health data space, so there can be multiple ones for if it applies, if there are multiple legislation that apply to the dataset.
Yeah, and in the scope, of course, of this guideline, in the high value dataset regulation guidelines, there will be mandatory stated you have to use the bottom one. So at least this one has to be there.
And there's a comment from Germany that Germany already has a property within the DCAT DE space, legal basis, which serves the same goal, I think. That's a question. Okay. That's
so it is essentially a proper, the same proposal, the same addressing, the same goal, with a different name of property.
Yeah, not a question, a remark. We already have it. It's a literal for us, not a URI, but we probably would harmonize and switch to applicable legislation.
Yeah, the goal here, the reason why we can do it is with the URI is we rely on this ELIs, and so we try to take benefit of this good practice.
And Jill asked a question about Inspire that also has a property for legislation specification, and I think we need to look at the definition of those properties to see if they are actually exactly the same. But as I just see it here, I guess it serves the same purpose. But that's a question of the mapping, I guess, from Inspire.
Then we have indeed to look into the Inspire metadata and if we can apply it and what are the rules and what are the freedoms that they are offered over there.
Yeah. Okay, I'll suggest we move on.
Okay, good. So we agree on this as a good suggestion. Then there are two implementation guidelines I want to discuss with you. The first one is that consider the situation that you have a data set that you have identified as a high value data set. Then the goal is not to enforce that all the distributions are in scope of the high value data set regulation, but only the ones that you consider to be in scope. So it's according to the drawing on the right hand side. We have a data set which is a circle or the oval, and the yellow distribution triangle is a high value data set, has been identified as in scope of that, and the two others are not. And the rules and the application of the implementing regulation apply only on the yellow ones and not on the blue ones. So as such, why that we propose this guideline is that we want to have a minimal impact on the existing metadata. So otherwise there might be kind of shuffling around and restructuring just to satisfy the rule. So we actually just want to annotate and color it. And we see that this will facilitate as well cross metadata translations, for instance, from the Inspire ISO world to DCAT-AP, that we can facilitate this more easier. Okay.
Any comments on this? Any questions? Any observations? I understand, Bert, you're saying this makes it actually easier. This doesn't require going back to existing metadata, so it's minimal impact.
It's minimal impact. The goal is to have minimal impact to restructure. Otherwise, you might have to enforce to restructure the metadata that you have being recorded.
I don't see any objections to this.
Okay, good. Then I switch to the second guideline, which is a variant of it. Of course, it's not only about distributions. We have APIs or data services into the game. And that means that in the situation is that you have an API associated and identified as one that serves the purpose of the requirement in the high value data sets to be the API of that high value data sets. Then you might have used that API as well to expose other data sets. And this is a typical example is in the geospatial case, where you have on the same API different layers, and one of the layers is a data set that is in scope of the high value data set, and the other ones are not. And then you get this kind of coloring, as you see there, where one data set is in scope and the other two are not in scope. And again, here, there's no enforcement that all of the data sets that are exposed to this API are high value data sets. So we leave it open, it's free. So we allow mixed exposure on that. And so there's no, as a side effect as well, no impact or direct impact on the non-high value data sets that are served by this API. However, of course, yeah, I'll go last and then Max will give the question. You have to know that there might be side effects because of the high value data sets that you are exposing. There might be requirements that it must be, for instance, according to a certain format. For instance, you have to, by the regulation, have to use XML as output, and this is forced, and you want to retract that, you cannot. So then, otherwise, you will be infringing that requirement. So there might be side effects that you might have. Okay, Max, what was the question?
Yeah. I had a question from Mihai, basically still on the previous slide. If you have, what does it mean that not all distributions are mandatory according to the regulation? And how do you differentiate if there are some distributions that are and some distributions that aren't?
Yeah, okay. So what is the regulation only mentions typically one distribution, the bulk download. So that is the only one. And you have to identify the one that is in scope according to your domain data category specific one that is the bulk downloads. You might offer other bulk downloads or other downloads or other variants that supported for the community, but that is not the one that is required by the regulation and by the legislative perspective. Oh.
And a similar question from Mantas. If some of the data service APIs are HVD and others are not. That is basically what you were saying in the next slide.
Yeah, and to coming on say into annotation sense of the goal is that we annotate with our property applicable legislation each of the elements that are in scope. That's the approach, that's the suggested approach. So you apply applicable in legislation for this dataset, applicable in legislation for that distribution, or applicable in legislation for that data service.
And then Kuldar asked the question, are distributions that according to HVD the same as distributions that are not? And that HVD requirements only affect dataset description. But I think from this diagram, it shows that they're not the same. The distributions that are according to HVD might have different elements, might have different sets of data. So
there might be in different formats. If you say you have to express your data as a download according to the Inspire structure, then this is the one that is imposed by the regulation. But you might expose it in a format that is used by, let's say, Google charts or whatever, which is not according to the Inspire structure, just to make a nice Google map. And that is not in scope, of course, of the regulation. So it is you have to dissect and look into what is each individual legislation requesting from you, and to assess which one is in scope and which one is not. Of course, you can take as member state maybe some voluntary and say, okay, I want to have everything in scope, but that's up to you as a choice. So we don't want to force it by design. We leave it up to you how to do it.
And there's a question from Lena. What does it mean to have minimal impact on, for example, Inspire?
Okay, what does it mean here is that if we enforce a particular structure, and a very strict structure in DCAT-AP, that you want to bring the two worlds together of the ISO structure and the DCAT-AP structure, and you have to map it, then you have to be able to that it's mappable. And the more restrictions we put at the level of DCAT-AP, the harder this transformation becomes, or the more that we already decide how it is in Inspire. And we want to leave maximum freedom to the Inspire community to tackle it, to give that. So this proposal is to leave maximum freedom on it.
Okay, let's move.
Okay, so that was the two topics on that, the identification. So now we have colored it. Aside of coloring, there is these 6 thematic data categories. And here we want to introduce another property with a specific new code list to be created, of course, still yet, with the 6 thematic data categories. And that is to, so R5R, and not MAG, but R5R, high value dataset category with this one.
Okay.
So this is not stating anything else as that. So you are part of this category, nothing more.
Okay. Any comments there? I think this is a specific property to identify one of the 6 categories, so that it's clear to which category it belongs, but as you say, it may belong to more than one category.
Yeah.
In certain cases, there could be overlaps. Any comments there? Any objections? Any observations?
I have a question. Is it also allowed to use this category for non-high value dataset, non-high value datasets? So if I want to, because the 13 categories we have right now are sometimes not matching, and it would be nice, for example, to mark our geospatial data with this property, but also the non-high value datasets. Would that
okay? So that's a good question, Jesper. So the goal is, first of all, what will happen is that we will introduce those 2 properties we have discussed, 2 new properties at the level of DCAT-AP as optional properties. And then you're free to use. But in the case of if you're in the high value dataset scope, then we ask you to fill in them and to use them. So it's and of course what you have to be particularly careful is that in the end, in the final reporting, that there's some consistency. That you don't mark something as looks like a high value data set, but that you actually don't, as you, the member state that you represent doesn't want to be a high value data set. So you have to be on the level of that consistency, but there's no there will not be blocking. It's only in this case. We will do this in this approach.
Did I see Mihai come up with a hand, or did you lower it again?
No, it was just an approval for this.
Okay, good.
It clarified what I was asking in the previously. Thank you.
Okay, so I see no objections to this. So then we move to. Oh, Jill comes back to the previous slide. Is the proposal to document conformance for each distribution individually, and the answer is yes.
Yes, we want, if we want to give maximal freedom, we have to do it individually. That's otherwise we have to. The answer of the new property is very simple, because then we have clear semantics for which purpose, and we don't have avoid the mixture of existing semantics with other semantics. So we want to create a clear, unique purpose. So you can do as Jesper suggested. You can start to use both, or to prefer one or the other, and then derive one of the other. That's fine for us. But in the end, we want to have the semantics clear for each property.
And Ludger adds that it would make Sparkle and Shekel complicated if you would use DCAT theme for both.
Yeah,
okay.
That's another things, and portal design and so on.
Let's conclude that this is okay, and then we move.
So C2.
Excuse me, Irini raised her hand, but she lowered up. Irini, would you want to say something?
Yes, I wanted to ask something. Maybe it's a silly question, but couldn't there be like a parent property that that has some kind of inheritance, and the HVD people can use only for the high value datasets, and they can use this can infer that it has this type of subject, this specific dataset, and use in general the more generic one for their own datasets? Because this question has been risen, if I'm not mistaken, also in the previous meeting. If they could use, I can understand. I would not say use this property for other categories which do not correspond to the legislation of HVD, because it's semantics and we need to have clear semantics, and this could lead to confusion. But maybe it can be linked with some hierarchy to something else.
So there could be well, there's if
it's not linked already, sorry.
No. So what is the possible linking of subproperty level is that DCAT team is a subproperty of DCT subject. So at a high level, we could at minimum say that high value data category is a subproperty of DCT subject. That would make them independent. If we would make them a subproperty of DCAT team, then it might be confusing in the end if you apply it. So if it would be if I would introduce a subproperty relationship, I would apply it to DCT subject in the same style as DCAT team. That's so that could be.
Okay. Shall we move to the next one?
Okay, good. On C2, I have 2 slides. The first slide was presented in the previous webinar already. So it was this on the identifiers and on the need and the requirement to have an online reference to metadata. And there we would rely on the DCAT-AP practice as what we have of using URIs and so on. So that was accepted in the previous webinar. What I want to highlight a bit is an implementation guideline on this topic. is that here we have to collaborate intense with the different domains, because what is the identifier that you want to see and to be sharing? So if you want to have it the same identifier in the DCAT-AP space as in your other metadata space, for instance, in the Aspire case, sorry, I will always use that as an example, then there must be an alignment made, and there have to be two. So that's an alignment to be made. So here the domains have, or the data category communities have to work together to make this transformation happening. And in addition, I want to highlight that there is previous work on identifier passing through this, and we have created a recommendation for that last year. And so if harvesters or portals would read that and would apply that, that would probably facilitate as well the goal of reaching a good identifier for each of the metadata.
But this guideline was approved in the previous webinar. So, yeah. Okay, let's then move on to the next one.
Okay, so this one is was discussed in the webinar, and I got a long discussion as well on GitHub, and there are a few changes in the wordings and in the presentation of this topic. So I have a few slides for this one. The first one goal is that the goal is to represent legal information, not only license information, although you find in the regulation reference mostly to license or terms of use. So the goal, I take it here as the whole legal information. What is the legal use information on it? And we agreed that we follow the same principle as in for DCAT-AP to stay at the most precise level, and that where possible, you could use the code list of the publications office. So as a basic guideline to reformulate it and more precise, you can use the properties license or rights. And then there's an additional requirement coming from the high value datasets regulation that you should use a URI. Why? Because you should be providing the information machine readable as is in human readable text, and you should be able to get this to this. So that is the element that is additional into it. And there's an additional element in the regulation, is that there's a goal to put a bar, a level of reusability into it, and CC by 4.0 is the reference. And the goal is that we should be able to assess the legal information with regard to this reference. And to address that, and that was maybe not so clear in the previous webinar, the goal is to add additional properties to license documents, a set of mapping properties. Not decided yet which one, but there's, for instance, see also, same as, or discuss matching properties that we could use to relate to a reference, and the proposal is only to relate to a code list by the publications office. And the goal is here to be able to assess whether or not you are in par with the bar or the reference request or not. So to make the assessment possible. So how does this work? And I created a flowchart with different cases. And this would be kind of, depending on your on how you work, could be applicable. So the first goal is if you have only license information and you start with that, and then it's easy. If you can use the publications office controlled vocabulary, the license named authority list, then you should be okay. So we ensure that this is being in line and this can be worked. So if you use that, fine. If you're not using that code list, you might have a member state code list. What you have to do then is then to map the code list of your member state on the Publications Office code list, and ensure that your member state code list is dereferenceable, that all the codes are dereferenceable. So map into that. If everything is mapped, then you know that you have covered it, that you don't have an issue. If some of them are not mapped, then you have to do your own risk assessment. In the case that if you have a high-value data set that would point to a non-mapped, then you will be called for explaining how it is related to CCE by 4.0. If we allow, of course, in DCAT-AP even more flexibility. It's not only a shared member states code list, but you could have say, okay, it's really a license created and provided by the publisher. Again, there the same approach applies, but then at the level of the publisher of that license, this publisher has to map it on this license now, make that local license dereferenceable, so we have to do this. And that creates, of course, a risk because the responsibility of the high-level European regulation will be forced down to the level of the publisher. So as a member state responsible for the highest value data sets reporting, you have to take care that all the publishers in that case follow and apply those 2 steps. Okay. Now, of course, I will do the first 2 other slides. License, if you don't only have license, you might have rights. And if you have only rights, then in order to make the assessment, the proposal is to apply the same approach as for license and to map on a null, maybe on the license null or on a rights null, that we ensure that so that this assessment can be worked. So this here might be more collaboration to be needed as well, but you have to make it dereferenceable again. And if it's all mapped, then you know that you can do the assessment. Otherwise, you might not sure do we have the assessment. And if you don't do anything at all, you enter into the situation that you provide textual or whatever information on your high-value data sets, on the legal information, and then as a reporting, you have to come and explain in some way how it's more permissive than CC by 4.0. I don't know how, but then we can offer much more of support of the metadata. So this is outside of the level of the metadata support. So what addresses this is one of the questions is that does this proposal applies only for license information? We know that in the Czech Republic, there's always this challenge that actually for many open data, they cannot use the notion of license, but only rights. So this is applicable now. So we more clear, and it was already the intent of that. So it should work and keep this in line, so you can apply it. And there's a challenge, and this is not resolved yet, but by doing the assessment, there is as well was the request: can we use existing lists of URLs of Creative Commons, for instance? And here we enter into that's something that have to be brought back to the policy level, is that those URIs are not dereferenceable. So they do not satisfy one of the requirements. And so Connect will take up this activity to see what is the decision to be taken on those. So this was on the legal information. So
any comments here?
I might go back to my flowchart.
I don't see any comments, no objections. Maybe this is too complicated for people who are not lawyers, but I think this was something that tries to be in line with all the requirements of HVD and identify some of the risks that you incur if you don't use it the same way. Manta said it's too complicated, and it is. So we try to take into account all the comments that we'd had to come up with this proposal.
I have a comment here. What is the license must be machine readable, so I must have an URI or something like this. So what if I have a CC BY license and want to allow people to contribute to OSM, so OpenStreetMap? So I must add in text to allow this. So it's not a clear CC BY license, but new license. It isn't a new license, but I must create a national list or national license.
So what typically, if this is if your clauses satisfy CC BY normally as it, and you want to explain more additional, you want to precise more of some of the clauses into it, you can use the combination of license plus rights. That's it. So it's not exclusive. The two are not exclusive. So typically, if you want to add this extra text or something, this becomes on the rights. In the proposal is that if you use licenses, then it's easier to make them, let's say, accessible, because they are typically a collection of a set of clauses of legal rights together, and that is identifiable with a unique identifier. So this is easy accessible. At the level of the rights, it is way more difficult. There's not yet a database of rights available. And here, so this part in the middle, that at this moment is a bit of theory, in the sense that the reference list of rights has to be made for the assessment. And that might exist in your member state or in your context already. You might have this list, but then it should be transferred and aligned with, let's say, the publications office or the EC, the policy level, that this is a list so that you can do the assessments. So I try to facilitate here in the assessment process.
The question whether there is a need for an additional property to provide the attribute if the license requires that. Not quite sure whether that would be necessary.
Most of the time, I see practices that people, some portals uses rights for it as this escape for that. But
and I understand that Germany has a property in their profile to attribution by text, for example.
Yeah, so this is a fine approach as well. So it is not in contrast to each other, but it is at least it's recorded. So that's important that we have it and that it is available for users to read it. There might be some proposals to align and to make a more general DCAT-AP level agreement on that.
And there's a comment from Jill that if a policy doesn't allow the use of existing CC licenses, then it complicates the implementations for the users. And I think that's correct.
Yeah, that's this one here, but this is beyond, let's say, the metadata. If I just read technically, so here the policy has to make a decision.
Okay. Okay, if we have that covered, then I want to come back to Ine made a comment about C2, the previous one where I said, and I think that was what was decided in last meeting, that this was approved. And Ine says that she hadn't had enough time to consider this.
Okay.
Ine, do you want to say something about that?
Yes, it's more than general thing from me, because last meeting we were overwhelmed with all the issues and had not time to prepare, and so there was asked on agreement on it or not, but we are not able to give good feedback because we were not informed, had no time to reflect on it. So that's a general comment on the process, and I would appreciate it very much if it is possible that you can have also now more time to think about the impacts of all those complex issues and can give feedback on it and come back to it, and not directly saying from we can accept it or not, because I can say it this, I can say I agree on it or not, but I think we cannot oversee the impact directly from all those complicated things. So it has no value on this moment to agree or not agree.
Okay, so I would suggest that if we have a proposal and you feel that you're not able to agree or disagree, that you make a comment about that so that we know. I understand what you're saying, but we need to move on. You also understand that. And if you have objections to agreements, then you should express that at that time. Also, you may express that later. You do it now, but I understand you're not saying you disagree. You just say you don't know if you can agree or not. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So we'll try to take into account all the comments that we get, but we only can do that if and when we get them. So if you have a specific objection or second thought about a proposal and an agreement, then you are free to express with why you disagree and how you would want to change the agreement. Is that does that make sense? We're open to all your comments, but you need to make them before we can take them into account. You understand that? So we try our best to give people enough time. Of course, sometimes we don't. Sometimes it goes too fast. But if you think it's go too fast, I would ask you to come forward with your objections.
Yes, I understand you have to move on, and I appreciate it if you can also say from we are going too fast, we have to think about some issues for some weeks or something like that.
Yeah, and we do that. We have done that in the past also. If we have a proposal, we had proposals last time where there was so much discussion because people didn't understand or didn't have the time to consider it, and then we moved it to a discussion on GitHub and saying, well, if you have, but we need to actually, in that sense, are reliant on you to come forward with your objections and your comments. But we'll take them into account as much as possible, and if you still have them, I would suggest that you fairly quickly come up with your objections and your counter proposals, for example. Is that okay with you?
Yes, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay, so we have done the first three. You want to have a short break for people to stretch their legs? I think that's a good idea to come back at 10 minutes past 3. Okay.
Okay, good.
Okay, let's get started again.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good.
Go ahead.
Okay, so now we have first three short ones just as an interpretation, and they were, let's say, it's just an interpretation in DCAT-AP of terms in the high value data set regulation. One is bulk downloads. As already mentioned, in DCAT-AP we have the notion of distribution. We discussed in the past what distributions and APIs are, and in this terminology, this would correspond to a distribution. So that's just aligning and focusing what, if you map things, we would call it a distribution, a bulk download. That was as well simple here in the sense that what happens for bulk download, you need to be accessing in DCAT-AP. There are two properties available, access URL and download URL. The download URL is the explicit where you can get the data in one click from it, and it's not always available. And so therefore we follow just the standard DCAT-AP practice. We keep the property access URL mandatory and the download URL is optional. So this is nothing changed. That is, so just reminded the current practice of DCAT-AP to apply for the scope of bulk downloads. That's, I think here will nothing be.
Any questions?
Not sensational.
No. I see no comments. I see no hands raised. There's a question from Mantas.
Siri, and that is not a bulk download. Here, this is a question that is more towards a data category specific case. So that you have to take into account. And what you have to say is that some discussions, for instance, at the level of Inspire, we were, Pauline and I joined the meeting in the first meeting on where they started the activity. And it was one of the topics was there indeed, what is a distribution and what is a service? And they have some guidelines in that domain. So they say some outputs are services, some outputs are downloads. Mm-hmm. So this is depending on the domain, and this is what we want, and you want to have to honor it. What is in plain language the difference between access and download URL? Access URL is you go on a web page where you find information how to access it. It might be that you have to you read the text and say something like you have to send an email to this person and then you get a link back. That might be an access URL. So it's the providing like that. A download URL is really the HTTP URL where you just click on it and that you use normally on a portal and you get it downloaded on your website.
Okay, go ahead. That's it, I think. So go to C5.
C5 is again a terminology. So there's a word of an API representation. So the word API. And here again, we apply the same mapping of the definitions, and the goal, what we said is that a high-value dataset implementing regulation API term is a data service in DCAT-AP. So that is essentially the terminology that we want to use in 101.
A question from Ine, I think on the previous one, whether the access URL could point to a capability document of a WXS service, and I think it is.
Yeah, that could be. I think here again, it has to do with the mapping of how the Inspire sees it and maps it into DCAT-AP. So this is a topic on this mapping level. So that's yeah, you need expert knowledge on the domain to make that decision.
Okay, so for on the API presentation. And
Okay,
if
so
the API is a data service, I don't.
Okay.
So okay, go ahead.
I think that there's nothing special here. What we have to highlight is that at the level of DCAT and DCAT-AP, there's for data service 2 properties, endpoint URL and endpoint description. So in the endpoint description, you point to the description of the endpoint, what it can do. Typically a Swagger Open API, get capabilities or something like this. What can it do? Whereas on the endpoint URL, you actually put the real value of the location of the endpoint where you can get the data, where you can interact with the service, with the API. So that is the goal of the 2 properties. And there's a long, in the draft guidelines, there's a longer assessment on persistent link and on those 2 properties, and on the property of endpoint URL and the URI of the metadata. But the proposal is keep at this moment to perform persistency activities on both, on the metadata level as well on the endpoint URL level. This is the current proposal on that. Yeah, we cannot enforce some structural reading on it, but that's let's say a guideline on to enforcing it.
And there was a question from Stefan about atom feeds. Are they also?
I don't know if somebody from DG Environment or GRC is here, but I think this is was one of the questions that was raised during that meeting. And I think, yeah, I don't know again the answer. I know that there's a debate about it and there has been a decision made in there. So I would refer to the Inspire community to make that there.
Mantas has a question about whether a URI that has dynamic arguments is acceptable for a distribution. Not sure there is any statement that says you can't.
No, the goal of what the goal is for a distribution is anything that provides you the full content of the data sets. That's by definition the idea behind a distribution. So and we try to motivate users of DCAT and DCAT-AP to follow that idea.
And I think for the URL, there is no rule that says how you have to create it. The only thing that we're saying is you should try to make that, do all the efforts to make that persistent.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
That's what we say here in order to satisfy this requirement in the regulation on persistent links. So it's an interpretation on that. And this has to be, of course, transferred. And this is back again an element that has to be discussed in each individual data category domain, how persistency is being handled. There's important exchange between the domains. Well, that is at that level. There are in the reporting additional things mentioned of terms in the implementing regulation on APIs, terms of use and quality of service, and we try to give an interpretation in DCAT-AP terminology what this can mean. And for terms of use, the proposal is to consider this the same as providing legal information. So if you provide good legal information according to the guidelines in C3, then you satisfy the requirement of providing terms of use information. That is the proposal, so we use that. If you want to have additional information or something like this, of course, add more information, that's fine, but at least minimal this. And the other one is that there's a mentioning of quality of service. and quality of service, then there is some enumerated values that are hinted in the regulation of what does it mean. And so there are many aspects of this. We don't have at the level of DCAT-AP a specific property that says quality of service document or something like this, or description. We don't have that. We do have, however, for the API, we can reuse landing page and say, okay, you annotate and you provide a landing page where you at least point towards information about the quality of service. So that we could add in as a, let's say, as a way of working to address the notion of quality of service information, that there must be a landing page for a high-value dataset API, so that people can find more information and hopefully quality of service information.
Any comments there? Martin asks, is there any form of validation foreseen for H3D, as in Inspire with the Inspire reference validator?
So with regard to validation, there's a two-level validation. One is we are capable to generate a shackle shape to validate if your metadata that you would report is according to the guidelines. But of course, we cannot validate, for instance, in this case, if you have provided sufficient information of the quality of service, because you have to read into each of the elements. So this is difficult things. Here, policy might help. So there might be connect. So Mikael or Daniele might add that there maybe comes a strategy to provide particular types first. And in that case, if there's some strategy on particular aspects of the quality of service to make that first visible, then we can support with additional properties. So I don't know, Mikael or Daniele, if you have intentions yet, or is it first this level is sufficient?
Well, as far as I know, we don't have this intention yet. We have to discuss it in our internal team, so I don't have answer for this yet.
Yeah.
But we can raise it in our internal.
Yeah, I know it's an important point, but at the same time, it's not so difficult then to evaluate in a quantifiable way the quality. So
we have to define it. So if at this moment we are, let's say, at the level of metadata, we cannot go beyond this. And that's what we have. If you at the policy side comes with more specific criteria, we can take it up.
no, again, as it was said before, on the going beyond this recommendation and making something more obligatory for the time being is not yet foreseen. I think we need some time also to digest this first phase, because it is relatively new, and so far we have worked more on this recommendations level, which has worked quite well, and this is a new step. So before entering into a more structured, in the sense of defining some obligations, I think we need some more time.
Okay, good. So I think here we might listen to the different data categories if they provide something specific, and to collect on that if we come on that, and to point out on it. So
there's a clarification from Ludger saying, well, you're adding a DCAT landing page to the data service and you make it mandatory for quality of service.
Yeah, and made it mandatory with the intent to capture quality of service information.
Hagar suggested maybe landing page is too specific and might want to use OF page for that.
That is an alternative.
Because landing page has a certain connotation that's a landing page that you go there as. So that would be another the counter proposal to use a more generic property FOF page.
That's fine for me. I have no objections as such.
Can I see show of hands of people who want to have FOF page instead of this? People say +1 if you want to modify this to FOF page. I see a +1. I see Jesper saying FOF page. Anybody disagreeing, please come up with a -1, or if you have a. So I see no objections.
Okay, let's propose this.
FOF page is fine. I see, Nicholas. Let's take that as the outcome of the discussion, that people seem to be favoring FOF page instead of DCAT landing page.
Okay, good. That's fine. That's fine proposal.
If there are any objections, please speak up or come back to us later. But for the time being, we're taking this as an agreement to use FOF page for this particular purpose.
Okay, good. Noted and done. Here
Okay.
we come to topics that we have not yet discussed in depth in the previous webinar. Not so difficult either, but something more than we used for DCAT-AP. Namely that in the context of the high-value datasets regulation, there is a need to point out the point of contact to the API. So there's an explicit request for that. So we have point of contact in our metadata as a notion. So let's use it and so make it mandatory for the APIs. And then, of course, the question raises, should it only be for the APIs, or should it as well to be applicable to the datasets or dataset series and so on? And so we would recommend it only for those. So the proposal is to make it mandatory for APIs, so to match it minimally to the regulation, and to recommend it for the others. And within addition, add some two properties and to say, okay, either you provide an email address or a web form address. So to give a bit of guideline that it's not whatever, and that we have some uniformity into the provided information of the contact point. So either an email, either a web form address.
Okay. Okay, I see comment from Ludger to use vguard has a URL, and I think that was in instead of FOF page for the previous. I would suggest that we move that to GitHub.
No, sorry. It is about the contact point.
Okay.
GitHub.io,
we used we used FOF. Yeah, I don't know by heart now. I'll quickly check it.
It's for the agent. How to find?
We have mapped it on FOF page. Yes, we have mapped it as well on FOF page. So your suggestion is to use for the web form address as URL, and to stay within vcard because we are the class is a vcard kind to stay within vcard.
So that makes it. That makes sense to use vcard for this as well rather than FOF page.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a suggestion to replace. Well, fine. That's a good argument.
Yeah. So I would suggest that for the previous point and for this point, we also open a GitHub issue. It's already there. So if people have further comments, then we can pick them up from there. Yeah.
Okay, is there any other comment on should we make it more mandatory or something like this? So
what you're saying is it is the regulation makes it mandatory for services.
Yeah.
For the API basically.
Yeah.
It's not. There's no. We don't say you can't use it for any other, but the question is, do people want to make it mandatory for others? I know there is no requirement from the regulation to do that.
Yeah.
So maybe we should leave it open.
Okay, we leave it then open.
Well, Mihai said it's mandatory, but mandatory, it is mandatory for the data services. That's
yeah. But so it's the question is now, do you want to have it mandatory for data sets and catalog and the other proper classes?
There's no comment. I say questions from Jitse. What's the advantage of using vCard has URL instead of FOV? And I think we just said, Bert, that contact point are usually relies on vCard, so it would actually be more consistent to have vCard property rather than FOV, mixing it, as Ludger says. Okay. Good.
Okay, good. Then
need to move on a little bit.
Move on for this one, and then we have a topic. One that there's as well a lot of discussions on GitHub on it, and I maintained only the two options out of the three to be discussed, and to make a proposal only to keep to go for option B. So option A is to be implicit, to be just relying on that it is well annotated, etc., and to say, okay, it complies to the specific data structures requirements that are specified in the legislation. And option B is to be more explicit and say wherever you can be possible, you point towards the data structure information, and to try to be explicit and to make that more visible. So what does that mean is that option A is, yeah, we know that it's labeled as a high value data set. Okay, that's sufficient to know. And in principle, we can go to the regulation and to find, okay, it's in the scope on this domain, and therefore it should follow according to that domain, these data structures. So it's very, yeah, hard to find and to check, but so you have to rely just on the identification of the high value data that is correct. A little bit more explicit is that we use the property conforms to express a relationship with a public document that describes the internals of the dataset. And in many cases, this is a request that you comply to a particular data structure, so schema or application profile and so on, like this. And to make that more explicit is actually an added value for reusers. So the proposal is to recommend to do this and to use DCT conforms to point to the schema, to the structure of the information, that how it is being shared.
So your proposal is to go for option B.
The proposal is to go for option B and to encourage metadata publishers and the writers that they as well document to which schema they adhere to.
Jesper, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, is that a property for a distribution? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Or
yeah, the property this term conforms to. That's the property.
And does it link to the machine interpretable document? So the, for example, the XML schema itself or the JSON schema itself, or the web page that
it can do both. There's no requirement on one or the other. There might be that some domains, and this I have to come back to the domains. So it might be in some domain you have very well structured XSD schemas, and then you say, okay, please use the XSD schema into it because that's the most valuable. In others, there might be just generic HTML documents or something like this describing it, or something like that. So it is a bit of hard to enforce the particular format that we cannot make that, because that would force certain domains to make certain other technical choices and so on, so that we cannot impose, but we can encourage sharing the information.
And I think there are two people who said that they would like B, and there are two people who said basically what you're just saying, to make it mandatory for this to point to something that can be used for machine readable evaluation. And you just said, Bert, that we're probably not in a position at this point in time to require that from all the domains to do that.
So the option C, that what Mantas is referring to, and it has been discussed in GitHub, is to be more precise and to ensure that you can, based on this information, have a precise check, a machine processable check, whether or not the data conforms to it. So if you can do that, of course, this is very nice and very welcome, but it is very hard to enforce that on all domains at the moment. And probably this is as well domain specific. I can imagine that in the case for SDMX exchange, where there's a flow and you connect to the SDMX data exchange, that there might be a verifier and that you might have a checkpoint into it and have it validated. But I don't know if this holds for all the data sets.
So I understand from the comments that people are in favor of having the possibility to do machine readable evaluations. And I think, Bert, you said we would want to encourage people to provide those kind of information through conforms to, but we can't actually make that a mandatory requirement.
We cannot make a mandate, and we cannot, unfortunately, cannot say it has to be in this structure or this tool or whatever. But that is actually domain specific and data set specific. Yeah.
And Ludger asked, who is creating those public documents?
Okay, that's a good point. Normally it is the domain itself that it will create. It might be, for instance, the Inspire community might have created an XSD that says you have to conform to this. And so that means that data sets should refer to that one at minimum, but maybe a member state has a more stricter and enhanced version of the same XSD, and I could use it, could refer to that. And then it's better as well, at least to refer to that. There's no list at this moment, and not listed into the regulation either, of which are the schemas to satisfy. There might be agreements in each data category domain that they have strict rules about it, but we don't know.
So I have, from the comments, I see that people agree with having explicit statement about the art of, about the state of the art, the explicit indication of what it conforms to, and we all, there's lots of people who think it should be really, at least in the future, machine readable to be used for automatic evaluations.
Yeah. And I see a last comment here for the core vocabularies. That is a good candidate, but it applies only to one domain on business registers. That's
which is actually mentioned in the regulation, isn't it?
That's even mentioned in the regulation. So in the regulation, there's one case where it is mentioned, but for all the rest, it's the core vocabularies do not come into the picture as one.
And I think Ludger also makes the comment, if you tag it as applicable legislation HVD, is it then expected that it fully conforms to the requirements? And I think that's
the goal. That's indeed the goal. So this is where the balance comes with your member states responsible. In the sense, this becomes then on the reporting. This member state responsible has to build up the reporting, the final list, and then has to, you have to be consistent, of course. You can only on the list if you say I'm applicable, or and if you're not on the list, you should not be mentioning yourself as applicable. That is a coherency.
Okay, if we can then Panta says it's not, each HVD will not have a clear vocabulary, and that I think there are some that have inspire as necessary. There's the company one that refers to the business vocabulary, but indeed it's not as completely clear as you would want it, I think.
No, for instance, for the statistical domain, what happens is that they rely on the definitions of the tables as they are in the legislation. So you have one in the long list of the tables in the regulation of high-value data sets, and you find similar tables in everything with official statistics. And that's the description, the table description, the CSV style that they would exchange transformed in SDMX typically.
Good. I'm not quite sure.
Okay.
Kuldar has a suggestion for a roadmap.
This is something that we have, when I pointed to Daniele and Mikael as want to connect. So there's suggestion from a roadmap on the policy level, more like create a list of vocabularies that are relevant in scope, and then ensure that those are, let's say, correctly maintained and be available as a second phase. And thirdly, that there comes an activity to ensure validation that all those elements can be validated. So that's, I pass it now to Mikael and Daniele. I think this is more a policy question.
I don't hear Mikael or.
Yeah, no, yeah, a bit, but okay, this is something which is, okay, we can maybe initiate a process, but that's normally not Connect who does that. This is something more on the publications office, or maybe even Digit. But this is also something that I think we have to make some reflection in the coming months to see how much we can go beyond.
Okay, so more information to follow. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And I see Lutger has hand raised.
Okay, I didn't see that. Lutger?
Yes, thank you. So this conforms to idea is just additional information. It's not really coming from HVD, because the data set, the data is HVD conformant, is already clear because it's tagged as legally conforming. So saying there should be some public document and the use of DCT conforms to is just a bonus. It's already the case that if we have data that is conforming to something we can link, then you should link it with DCT conforms to.
Indeed, yes. That's the need to take the bonus out of the regulation, saying, okay, there's a drive towards quality and agreed structures of the information to share that with the community. That is the bonus that we want to take out of it.
Okay, Bert, I want to suggest that you move to the next section because we have little time left. We have 15 minutes, so go ahead and present this part.
Okay, so this is the last topic. It's about mainly related to the reporting. So far we have been annotating and improving and coloring the elements into the DCAT-AP network. Now, how we know and how we get a list of information of the high-value data sets. And for those who are familiar with data portals, most data portals have a queryable endpoint, typically a SPARQL endpoint. In this case, I show here for data.europa.eu, that is the harvesting of all open data portals or data portals in general in Europe. And we can do a machine readable querying using SPARQL. And the goal is, of course, that we can, with this activity, with the annotations that we do, that we can bring as well the high value data sets forwards, or the ones that are, let's say, on high quality and managed on high quality, being forwards on the level of national or EU level. So we can think of many queries, find all the data sets that are in scope of the high value data sets, find all APIs or data services that are in scope, find all bulk downloads, find those data sets and have their bulk downloads and APIs together, find all the licenses that are being assigned to entities in scope, so to do this legal assessment. All these queries, they are in the previous slide deck, and to shorten the time, we jumped towards the last one. Essentially, the goal is, in the end as well, what is actually in my member state in this big spot of data.europa.eu? What are the data sets in my scope? And what we have to observe is that member state data in a harvesting catalog from data.europa.eu is not necessarily the result of harvesting a single member state data portal, a single point, but typically it might happen from multiple data portals. And so it might be that in order to satisfy the whole high value dataset implementing regulation, you have to pick information, dataset descriptions from multiple datasets to find the member state collection. And what we have to observe is that, as general, we cannot rely on some, let's say, information of metadata information at DCAT-AP that would cover a jurisdiction or legal responsibility. So this spatial is geographical oriented, it is not jurisdiction oriented. So the proposal is actually to do the following and to rely on a property of DCAT-AP, namely that you can create a new catalog where you actually collect references to the elements that are in scope for your member state. So what we could ask to each member state, and that would say, I would like to do the reporting through DCAT-AP high value datasets structured information, that they create a new catalog where they point towards the elements that they say, okay, this is in my scope of my reporting and I take responsibility for this. That would mean as follows. So that is the visual representation. There have been annotations made on the individual datasets, distributions and services. And then a member state would say, okay, I provide you a catalog which points towards the different entities, and that's my responsibility. So to the reporting authority, I provide the yellow one. And if you're familiar with RDF annotation, so you have on the left-hand side two catalogs, on the right-hand side the new catalog that you would, as member state, to refer, and then you see that it is only, in this case, example of data sets into a list of referring, because of URIs, to the different entities in the different catalogs. And it's just like that, and that is a list, and based on that information, it can be used to query the whole collection back from this thing, we can query the whole. So we know everything. There's no need to repeat the metadata the references are sufficient.
The question is that from Mantas, is this only annotated data or is it a physical entity?
The goal is that this catalog is a new file with references to the dataset. So it is a new physical entity. It's like similar, like if you would create an Excel sheet where you would list everything into it. So this is all the URIs that I would report. This is, but then a catalog level of DCAT's way of expressing the Excel sheet of interest.
And Ines says it's a virtual catalog based on the selection of the data sets that conform to HVD. Yes, that's correct.
It's a virtual catalog, but this is where it's kind of, if you rely and if you apply the DCAT-AP guidelines of persistent identifiers and you apply this very, very well, and then you extreme care in all of your areas that you as member state are responsible, then you actually, it is very easy. Because if you can use this identifiers, you just can point to it, you rely on it and you can do that. So it depends on the quality of use as well in your own country of this DCAT-AP level of it. As drawback, of course, it means that if you want to have a member state view in DataEuropa.eu, they have to know and to be provided with this catalog. So otherwise they cannot make let's say a summary for your member state and associate it with your flag. That is the proposal.
Any comments there? I think maybe this is something that people need to think about a little bit, but I think this is a proposal to do it that allows everybody to actually see that particular cut out of the catalog, which is just the stuff that is HVD compliant.
For your member state. So this is the member state responsible is that in the end, does the reporting should be able to say, okay, this is the elements that I take responsibility or as member states take responsibility of, and that is the list. And on that, the assessment has happened.
Ina remarks that it's the same way that Inspire does this. So that seems to be in line with current practice. Okay.
Okay.
So no more comments. Then.
Okay. Then we are actually addressed all topics. Good. Now I will share a quick walkthrough to the right. Do you see my screen now with the
yes.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Very good. So we shared on the URI that is in the slides as well and in the invite on a draft HTML representation of the guidelines. So that if you have comments on it and so on, yeah, please provide it to GitHub or any other means that you can find. And what is in there, it is, we have a high-level introduction, scope. We point to the meeting minutes. We keep a track on the status. You can reuse this, and then you can find an overview of the elements that have additional comments or additional requirements in the scope of the high-value datasets regulation. And the goal is that those only apply, of course, if you want to do the annotation. So if you want to be in line with the high-value datasets regulation for that, and you want to annotate a amount to make it visible, then those should apply. Then you have to read in. And so we have tables for each of them. There's a reference back to DCAT, and there will be a reference to DCAT-AP so that you can follow it back. That is for each of the topics on there. There is these blue buttons that you find here, allows you to, if you click on it, to create a quick GitHub issue. So on it, so if you want to specifically to have a comment on it, you can create. It will create automatically a GitHub issue so that we can have a discussion and we know about what line that we are discussing.
Mantas asks for examples in Turtle, if possible.
Examples in Turtle. We don't have yet examples, so that's that could be added indeed.
I think we might also want to invite member states to provide examples when they're working on this, so that we can integrate them.
And to mention that this document is the first version of the document. It will be enriched based on today's discussion. So it is a first draft. We will create some update based on the current discussion. But please go ahead to also provide us examples.
Yeah, and you will find then after the individual entities with their table, I think there's some global guidelines and usage. So the explanation that was provided today through the webinar, so the reasoning behind, and sometimes an explanation that needs, let's say, more information that cannot be fitted just in the table. That will be here. We have a new section that is the same section for DCAT-AP on legal information, just to remind the general practice. And then we have the different guidelines, and they are still numbered here according to the topics that we discussed, C1, C2, and so on, a little bit longer. In the end, it might be that we remove, of course, C1 and C2 because they don't mean anything. They're just for discussion purposes now included into it. So that's all those things. There's some high-level conformance on how you would do this. Is the same as for DCAT-AP. And in the end, we have added all participants of the previous webinar as gratitude to contribute to this. If you find yourself that it is you don't want to be on the list, or you want to be additionally on the list, we will correct, or if your name is wrongly spelled, then we will resolve it. Okay. So this is just a quick overview, and this is as well the new feature of the DCAT-AP documents that will come. So the other ones will be addressed in that.
Okay.
Stop. And then.
So we have 3 more minutes.
Okay, and then to wrap up the last bit. So as mentioned, we have provided kind of a global perspective. We highlighted that there is still a need, and then each member state to coordinate yourself across the domains and to make this reporting happening and to see what's needed. And of course, in the end, the reporting has to be done, but this is a first step towards the reporting, so that you at least as a member state or as a responsible person can get an overview over all the domains in a similar way of terminology. So that was our goal with the guidelines as well, that you can do this internal discussion. We will address your comments today. So if you have more comments, or you think we have missed a topic that was in the regulation and that was not well explained and needs a cross data category resolution, then be welcome and add them. So please involve yourself in the discussion on GitHub, and we will push the new updates on this release. And as mentioned, on the acknowledgements, and that gives us a big thank you for all your feedback and your contributions.
Any last comments, Pavlina? It will be published, yes. There's a question on the publishing of the slides. Yes, they will be available on JoinUp. Pavlina, up to you.
First of all, I would like to thank the audience. Please, gently request, provide us feedback on the documentation of the draft and put your comments into GitHub. And I pass the floor to Daniel or Michal to say if they want to add something. Daniele, Michal?
I think there's no.
Thank you. No, yeah, no, I don't think we have anything to add. Or Michael, you can go, but we are very pleased of the result of this second workshop. So we want to follow this up quite closely. We think that we will have to make the point sometime in a couple of months from now to see what has been the progress and define also the next steps, perhaps see if something else in the meantime has raised questions, but so far so good.
Indeed, I would only say thank you, Bert, Marx, and Pavina for preparation of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very well. That's welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, and it's 4 o'clock, so thanks for everybody for your participation, and we'll be in touch, and we'll actually be working with the GitHub comments to make this the final documentation for the guidelines. Thank you very much. And
Thank
Bertrand,
you.
thank you very much for your presentation and your work on this together with the team. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very well.
Okay,
Have a
bye-bye.
nice evening.
Have a nice afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.